Okay. Hi, welcome to Law and Justice. I'm Jane Mulcahy. This is a special series on the topic of relationships matter, and today I am very, very excited and honoured to be joined by Robert Balfour. How are you, Robert?
Good afternoon, Jane. Thank you for inviting me. I'm really well. So in rather cold and damp Yorkshire at the moment.
Very good. I'll be near those parts later in the week. I'm going to be in Liverpool tomorrow and Manchester in a couple of days. So hopefully the weather will be warmer by then. But we met as well in real life, which is lovely when I actually reconnect with people that I've met in real life in relation to a research project involving child sexual abuse survivors and researchers in York. And we had a great old chat. So um, before we kind of get into the subject matter of relationships and how they matter and child sexual abuse and healing and all of that, Rob, can you tell me a bit about yourself, please?
Yeah, so I am Rob Balfour, and I'm now technically approaching being an old age pensioner, seemingly, but I'm not far off the wherever they keep moving the retirement age for looking
Yeah.
at wherever that is. Yeah, so my background is I actually come from Liverpool. I was born in Wallasey, which is across the river from the main Liver building, which you'll be, I'm sure, wandering around and checking out when you visit. So take a good coat because it gets a bit windy on the river
Oh, good tip. Thanks.
and the docks. So all of that. So I was born there in the 1960s. So and I grew up around the docks. And then my life kind of changed with breakdown in my parents' relationship and stuff. And I ended up living somewhere in North Wales. And
Hmm.
I ended up being targeted by child sexual abusers, what would now be called exploitation, but it's child sexual abuse. And there
Hmm.
was a series of them. And to cut a long story short, I ended up in looked after care in the early 70s in North Wales, which was, I thought, an escape from the clutches of these kind of
Okay.
abusers. And it ended up being a large children's home run by an abuser.
Wow.
So, and that's the subject of history under the confined under the Waterhouse inquiry. So I won't revisit all of that. And it's fascinating. So I spent approximately 10 years of my childhood being surrounded by paedophiles. So, and surviving them and childhood, really. And my escape came at the end of looked after care, and I joined the Royal Air Force. So I was
Hmm.
very lucky. And in fact, I'm wearing the Royal Air Force motto on my
Okay,
hoodie.
right.
It is per astra, so through adversity to the stars. And I think that's a very apt way to talk about recovery in many ways.
Thank you, Rob. And you sent me a chapter that you wrote about your experiences, your interest in science fiction, as we can see behind you, and some of those mottos from the Air Force is really beautiful, powerful, interesting, not too heavy either, given the subject matter, but really reflective. And is that something that you like to do, Rob, to kind of write about your experiences and I suppose find meaning in them and through the activism?
Yes, I suppose we'll talk about it. But I found meaning in my own journey, to use the metaphor.
Mm.
It is a journey. It's a journey of exploration, really. So that's why the Star Trek thing.
Hmm.
In many ways, people, if we talk about stories, and I actually really believe in our 2 degrees in psychology, and both of them focused on the use of narrative, the way human beings relate to the world, really, by the stories we tell ourselves and the stories we're told. And so when I was a child going through that, nightmare of 10 years being surrounded by these dysfunctional human beings. Star Trek and Doctor Who were ways for me to kind of find meaning and to
Hmm.
tell me that because I had no role models left after I was kind of lost in this maelstrom, you like, of dysfunction of abusers. So for me, inside my mind, I could see some hope in Doctor Who. I could see some hope in Star Trek that the
Right.
human race wasn't all bad. And it sounds childish, but if you think about it, Captain Hornblower and all the adventures that people read in stories and children, Harry Potter now is
Right.
for young children, is, you find meaning in the way that people escape and do good and that you don't have to become part of the forces of darkness, if you
Mm.
like.
And especially, I suppose, because you encountered not just one a male paedophile, but multiples, that must have made it very difficult for any child, any boy to kind of look at adult men in a way that wasn't full of fear and threat, and that, what might they want from me?
It was complex. So I mean, because I previous to the abuse journey, I was surrounded with very positive male role models.
Oh, wonderful.
So I was very lucky. So most of them were in the military. So
Mhm.
I kind of had these role models who were all heroes in many ways,
Okay.
uncles and all the rest of it. So they weren't abusive at all. In
Mm.
fact, very working class docks. They were all born. I come born in the docks
Hmm.
of my side, just across the road from the river, as I said. So it's a very kind of working class space. But they were really that kind of almost classic working class stuff. You never hit a woman, you don't spit,
Okay.
you never kick somebody when on the ground, or you never carry a knife. Those were the kind of rules I was told when I was about 4 or 5.
Okay.
And my uncles were very kind of focused on that kind of stuff. And you did good rather than education was the route out of kind of doing stuff. So I wanted to be a soldier. So that's what
Hmm.
all I wanted to be. And then I went on the journey. And then you met these other dysfunctional males
Mm.
who seemed like they were like my uncles, but they weren't like my uncles at all.
Okay.
So there was a conflict inside a child's head, which then meant that I became, I suppose, adolescent and a delinquent is the language that was used in the 60s.
Okay.
So I was kind of still, we wasn't in trouble a lot with the police or anything. But if I remember a male school inspector finding me running around the streets because I hadn't gone to school. And he was a lovely man when I look
Mm.
back, because he must have been I was, relatively tall, but he was a guy who, now you think about it, he didn't speak down to you. He actually knelt down to speak
All
to you,
right.
which is kind of classic. I'll bring you, talk to
Yeah.
you,
At
on
your
your
level as
at your
equals.
level,
Yeah.
which is kind of really good. You could tell he
Mm.
was, he wasn't telling me off. He wanted to know, and I remember him telling me off, and I remember just smacking him because
Right.
he came too close
Yeah.
to stuff and bits and
A
pieces.
boundary violation, or you felt that one could be coming.
And because he was trying to get close to being
Yeah.
supportive.
Yeah.
Brian then was just clocking in one, and I
Yeah.
couldn't have been more than 6 or maybe 8 or 9.
Oh, wow.
So you're talking. That gives you an example of the world I was lost in, really.
Mm.
So but there were good males as well. So not all males are. There were a lot more males than there were a lot more good males than were bad males on my journey.
Yeah, and that's wonderful to hear and beautiful to hear. And I suppose, frankly, you're still alive to tell the story, which, other people sadly aren't if they've gone through similar things. And in the chapter that you wrote, you mentioned having these warm memories of attachment and stability and love and comfort, I guess, including from your uncles and also one of your grannies, I think. Were they vitally important in the light of then what happened? Do you think that made a big difference to have had those memories of beauty and love and trust?
Yeah, looking back now, I'm lucky to be here. So, as the chapter describes, there were contemporaries of mine in the looked after care environment who didn't get past 21.
Mm.
So they took their own lives, and some ways you're haunted by that as you get
Yes.
older. So now I'm in my 60s. I kind of think back, wherever my life has been, and I've had a good life in many ways, is that they never got to have that possibility, and a lot of that is undeserved because I remember them as kind of very intelligent and very vibrant and kind of full of life, really.
Mm.
But they were being exploited by these people in power, this particular person in power, and that led to their, taking their own lives. And that is a sadness, really, that you
Of
kind of
course.
think the regret. But I was very lucky that I had what someone described, I think it was a Japanese psychiatrist described as islands of hope,
Mm.
that human beings that I encountered, whether for many years in early childhood, my grandmother is a prime example of that, who was a domestic violence victim herself. She
Okay.
was, coercive, what we call now coercive violence, and experienced that for a lot of her marriage with my grandfather. And then there were other people who were just short moments of time,
Mm.
maybe just 10 minutes, an hour somewhere, who kind of saw you. I think that's the way I would describe it. They didn't talk to you, they saw you, that
Mm.
empathy thing,
Yeah.
saw who you were, and they listened and they saw you. And that carries that. Well, I described it the other day to somebody that when I come to the end of my days with the final seconds, and as you get older, you begin to realize that the clock is ticking
Mm.
without getting upset about it. And you
Yeah.
kind of know that your time is up, your time is not infinite, that I won't remember the dysfunctional people. They won't be in my mind at the end. In the end, all there'll be will the people who I remember as islands of kindness and and love, really, and affection. The rest of it will just be disassociation is misunderstood, and it can be a very powerful
Yeah.
tool if you know how to use it. So all the bad people will be disassociated out of existence. I won't give them a second's thought in my final minutes.
Yeah, that is beautiful, you know, to have had ample of the islands of hope um to bask in, you know, as you say in your final moments, because sadly, again, for too many people, they might not have gone through these type of experiences we're talking about now, but they've no memory of warmth and comfort and love. And that's really where um, the pain becomes unbearable for people, you know, and the fight absolutely impossible, I suppose. But Rob, to kind of move slightly away from your own story for a second, in a more general context, you know, because we've met and encountered one another online as well in relation to ACEs and trauma more generally. And they're very common. You know, they're not just stuck in poorer communities or you know, ethnically diverse communities or whatever we might like to fantasize about. And child sexual abuse happens in all economic brackets and education levels and religions and such like. Um, do you think that trauma is sufficiently well understood by, say, healthcare professionals, like ordinary doctors, by psychiatrists, and other caring professionals, like teachers, you know, like that school inspector, maybe, social workers and psychologists?
It's getting better.
Hmm.
One of the reasons ACEs is a kind of interesting piece of research, and even as you know, the researchers who did the research in the 90s don't actually like the word ACEs. They
Hmm.
didn't mean it to be kind of take on the life that it's taken.
Hmm.
I think what they meant when around, I think Preletti has talked about it, which is he saw it as a gateway to a conversation in systems. And I always saw it as that. So I didn't see the ACE thing was, I think you can change the letters around if you want to
Yeah.
change it, the same thing. So it's kind of it's to me, I saw it as a strategic opportunity for a conversation with systems about trauma itself and the fact that it underlines most of the issues that primary care GPs, for instance,
Hmm.
see when you know the stats. 60 to 80% of the people that attend for consultations in GP practices are often bringing somatic issues. They're not really bringing kind of things that you can scan for. I
Hmm.
just had my annual blood test, so my cholesterol's gone up, and now they're saying I need to think about statins and all the rest of it.
Okay.
Not that and I'm upset. I don't actually eat a lot of cream cakes, but most people, most people, it's called old age, isn't it? But most
Yeah.
people are actually kind of presenting with issues that can't be measured in a test tube for a blood test,
Hmm.
and doctors don't have a lot of time.
Hmm.
And I think the answer to many of those issues is time. And it is not necessarily GP time, it's other worker time. And that the reason that the ACE is useful is, or the research is useful, is to keep pushing that conversation for paradigm shift change in the way we understand people's lived
Hmm.
experiences and how that impacts them both psychologically and physiologically in their lived, in the way their bodies and minds cope, basically.
Hmm. And that I suppose, you know, if you have clocked up a load of adversities, particularly in the absence of these loving relationships or islands of hope along the way, you are more likely to maybe drink to excess or self-medicate with other types of drugs or eat really unhealthily to self-soothe, you know, and maybe get obese and And just even the links with violence, that you're more likely to be violent if you've had violence done to you, and you're more likely to be a victim of violence if you've experienced it as a young child. Really, to me, everyone should know it. And then to return to your story, Rob, do you believe in your activism now, and from all the people you've encountered along the way, that trauma, or specifically as well child sexual abuse, gets in the way of forming safe, trusting, reciprocal relationships with others?
I think it's. I mean, I think we tend to put sexual abuse survivors into this kind of category of very different experience to the
Hmm.
rest of the human race. I don't know any human being that's had an existence where relationships have been easy. There's
Mm.
nobody I've ever met who's kind of
True,
had this
true.
wonderful
Yeah.
experience of relationships, because it's learning. The issue for survivors of sexual abuse in particular is there is a higher series of barriers they have to leap to get to a place of safety in relationships because of the experience. So it's more polarized. But most human beings struggle to develop relationships. I don't know many who are some are very good, aren't they? They naturally are able to create relationships, and that works really well for whatever reason and meet the other people. But most people struggle with it. Most people kind of think, I know survivors are just more polarized.
Hmm.
And that's why good therapy allows people to kind of understand themselves and understand the risks they have to take. The world without relationships is an empty world. So, a world in the wrong relationships is just is just an unfairness on
Hmm.
survivors who choose the wrong path, or they kind of don't feel safe about things. So yeah, relationships are important,
Hmm. Thanks,
but
Rob.
mostly with yourself. It's the
Mm.
relationship with yourself that allows you to have relationships with other people that are safe and empowering.
Yes. While you were talking there, you reminded me of one of the things that Stephen Porges, who developed polyvagal theory, said about intimacy. And he was saying that, um, our bodies do scan for safety and threat, whether we know it or not. And again, that's not to do with child sexual abuse or anything else necessarily. It's just we're primed for survival. And that immobilization with fear is a kind of shutdown response, but immobilization without fear is necessary for intimacy, with another. So obviously, relationships are not all of a sexual nature, but to maybe connect in that safe kind of way with someone else can be maybe more challenging if someone has been wounded in a particular way. Um, but for sure, all of us as human beings, regardless of whether we've had big T traumas or little T traumas or none at all, if we've been so fortunate, relationships are a struggle, and we can be all very annoying and self-centered and just unthinking. And that is a great point, that no one gets an A plus necessarily from the get-go. So thanks for that.
And survivors, is a really simple thing, isn't it? Survivors are like everybody else,
Mm,
human beings,
mm,
with all the stuff that comes with being
mm.
a human being. It's just their experience. That's why we use a kind of messaging in our advertising, is that you are more than the experience of the child of sexual abuse. Because I think they often need to be reminded of that. And intimacy, physical intimacy, sexual
Mhm.
intimacy, they can do that every day, every week, every minute of the day if you want. Some people
Mm.
do that in addiction, but that interplay between two human beings, that two selves coming together, is the most magical thing when it happens, isn't
Yes.
it? If you
Yeah.
have that in your relationship, it's like you never want to let go of that when it
Mm.
happens. And when it starts to dissipate, you kind of worry about it, because it's
Mm.
like, but if you can retain it and manage it,
Mm.
that's what the blissful thing that you see people in their 80s and 90s holding hands down the
So
road.
lovely. Yeah.
And it is so lovely because they found that and maintained it.
Yeah.
They maintained that intimacy. They trust each other explicitly.
Mm.
And that has never been, or if it has been challenged, it's been overcome and kind of managed. And they've grown from it.
Mm.
And that's what survivors yearn for, really, is that kind of connection with themselves and others, so they feel safe to enjoy that blissfulness that comes
Yeah.
from finding that space.
And also, though, I imagine um, feeling safe enough to be playful and to have fun, because that's an aspect of relationships too. Obviously, there's the heavy stuff, and nothing is a cakewalk or a party all the time or a blissful state, but the kind of the being safe enough. And actually, I used to bang on about, services need to create safe spaces, or, it needs to feel safe, but probably feeling safe enough to take certain risks as well, to trust a new person, having maybe been hurt in a previous relationship or whatever. Um, that's quite brave, and depending on, again, it needn't be a child sexual abuse history, but a history where you've been hurt somehow in relationship to someone else. That then, I suppose, is more challenging for some people than others.
I mean, I think you can. I think you can create. I mean, it's very difficult, but for some people to kind of get this. But I think you can create what, in our context, the services that I work with survivors, a therapeutic kind of alliance safety very quickly.
Can
And
you?
it's about.
Okay.
I think so. I
Yeah.
mean, not 100% all the time, but for many people, they've never been seen or heard, and
Right.
they've never had direct communication with somebody who tells them that. So it's okay to be you. It's
Mm.
kind of, you can cry. It's okay. Didn't happen to you. It was done to you. By
Yeah.
changing the way you engage with somebody, you can actually, oh, instantly they kind of almost know that, this is different to what I've experienced
Mm.
before, and it's okay to be here, and
Yeah.
I'm willing, and that, is what the purpose is of. I think that the evidence and the research is that first engagement with somebody
Mm.
is really the key to all the other engagements when someone discloses. And if you get that wrong, doesn't mean to say it's the end of the story. It just gets more difficult
Yeah.
because it's going to take longer. But if you get it right, then actually the rest of the journey is empowered for that person, because they think, I found somewhere, this
Mm.
is okay to be here.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me. It reminded me as well that Bessel van der Kolk, during a training I did with him, he said, really, it doesn't matter what type of program or intervention you're specifically offering as a therapist. The real sort of success occurs if, through the interaction or the engagement, if I'm the therapist, that I can help you, let's say, with your affect regulation. So again, I suppose if you walk in full of shame because of what was done to you, and somehow by sitting together and by what I say and convey and validate and all of that, that some of the shame melts away a little bit. And as you say, you feel seen and heard, that is the beginning of kind of a release of that pent up energy, maybe as well, a little bit.
So you can put a sign above the door that says sexual violence service and welcome, and so you belong here. So I quite like belonging research.
Mm.
It's really interesting. But if you walk through the door and all you get is a kind of cold clinical approach and
Yeah,
stuff there,
yeah,
people kind of know they don't really matter. It's the
yeah.
kind of clinical approach that matters. So you have to belong, so it has to be badged, but you have to matter to the person who comes
Mm.
to you meet through the door. And if you combine those two things together, it's a magical thing happens.
Yeah,
People visibly relax and they lose all that fear, and they start to be them,
yeah.
and they start to express themselves, and often cry. So it surprises me that simple things make, and you think crying, I think carry on crying. I tell them keep on crying because
Well,
it's
it's a
important to
beautiful
cry.
energy release if those tears have never been allowed to come out through repression. And as you mentioned, dissociation, which is a brilliant thing for separating someone from an unlivable kind of experience. But over time, if you've lived 40 years without shedding tears, that's tough, I guess.
And in some cases, we've had clients who are dying.
Mm.
They've got cancer diagnoses and they're receiving treatment and they've never spoken, and they have horrific histories of being kind of locked into prisons of, not their making really, by the abusers and things that were done to them within systems. And they get release even in their final kind of days, that there is somebody, they matter,
Mm.
that it matters, and they found somewhere they can belong. That's all trauma informed is.
Yeah.
But the true challenge when we talk about it is the response to the trauma.
Yeah.
That is what we're starting. I think we're talking about there in relation to mattering. You have to matter to the
Mm.
person. That's empathy.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you mentioned that because I've asked before in other interviews, is it important that someone feels that you care for them? That like again, if I'm going to you and disclosing X, Y, or Z, that I actually, as a being in the world, matter to you. And sometimes therapeutic boundaries can be erected, it seems to me, that stop people from conveying that, either in words, but the words alone aren't enough. Is it important that the person has a felt sense of that mattering somehow?
Yeah, I think so. And we can think of a case of someone who's written a book called The Flying Child, Sophie Olsen.
Mm-hmm.
And if you read that story, and a therapist went, some people went out completely out. But I thought, yeah, well, that's what you're going to have to do
Yeah,
to someone like Sophie
yeah.
because of her experiences. And that's worked
Mm-hmm.
exceptionally well for a Sophie. So it's not one size fits all. Really. I think you've got to kind of be holistic. And I think there are limits that people, in the case of Sophie's therapist, who's lovely. So the way that they work together and the way that has worked. And I think you have to be, and she was willing to do that, Sophie. So, I'm not expecting every therapist to do that kind of intervention, but that worked for Sophie. And I'm not sure when you speak to Sophie and you understand her history, any other interventions would have been quite as liberating for her
Yeah.
in the way that that has been. And I think it's been very well managed. So as we go forward, I worked in mental health services. One of my careers was I worked in NHS mental health services with so-called long and enduring, which when you actually looked at the files of
Uh-huh.
kind of being abused in childhood, often ended up in looked after care. And then had it cycled into mental health systems and being given every diagnosis under the sun, and the real diagnosis was they had been abused in childhood
Mm.
and that hadn't been really dealt with. And we were told that it couldn't be dealt with because we weren't there to deal with the etiology. We were there to deal with the
Oh,
presenting issue. So, and to maintain them in a stable place with drugs, basically,
yeah.
and social interactions where that was possible. And when you looked at them, and when I look back now, the layering of secondary trauma and reversal inside themselves, whichever way you want to describe it, was sad because that's where
Mm.
the safety was for them to withdraw inside themselves and to be drugged,
Mm.
and they come off all that. So what Pat did with Sophie, I think, was amazing,
I
and people
agree.
should absolutely amazing.
Mm. But of course, she would also say, because I interviewed the two ladies and I've met Pat as well before, is that it shouldn't in a way have been all to her, because she had other clients. She also had a life that ideally there would be services that are more, well, obviously trauma informed and responsive, where there's a team of people with those values and skills. In a very healing environment, in a lovely setting, where people can be a few months, if needed, away from their family to work through the issues. Um, but certainly from talking to Sophie, the engagements with psychiatry, where she was told, the CSA didn't matter really, was in the past, and she was a grown woman and needed to confront herself and the severe enduring mental illness, did not seem very person-centered or validating or healing. And just to return to your own experiences there of working in the system, when you had your own experiences and had maybe seen the decline of other people, how is it to work in that system with that knowledge? And I presume a bit of a gut feeling maybe that it had something maybe to do with the people's distress. Was it difficult?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't particularly educated when I went into mental health services.
Okay.
I didn't have a higher education at all. So I had O levels. I'd kind of done some O levels in the 80s. But for some reason, I kind of intuitively knew when I started mental health services about 1990, well, actually about 1996, working in acquired brain injury. But I ended up going into mental health services. And I kind of had an intuitive knowledge about it. And I was reading more and more. So I'd actually read the ACE study in the early 2000s, would you
Wow,
believe?
okay.
Was doing. So I'd kind of come across it from another piece of research, and I thought that was interesting. So I
Mm,
kind of, to me, it made sense
mm-hmm,
that if you were traumatized, that if you were in environments where that was silenced, there were going to be worse outcomes, both physiologically and psychologically. And I'd seen and that come from a paper where they compared survivors of the Holocaust from the camps in Germany, those had stayed in Northern Europe, and those who'd gone to Israel
mm,
at the end of the war, and they compared their longitudinal health outcomes. And they were very similar in age and
mm.
experiences. So, and they'd looked at that, and the Israelis had looked at it. And the outcomes, the health outcomes were much more positive in Israel than
Wow.
they were in Northern Europe. And they couldn't quite work out what it was. They couldn't see why the
Mm,
be the health systems were equivalent, et cetera, et cetera. And I read that, and it dawned on me that actually it was about the culture.
mm,
So in Israel, they were acknowledged. There
mm-hmm,
was lots of representations of validation for the experience of being a camp survivor.
mm.
Where in Northern Europe, that may have been the case for a year or two after the war, but
And
then
then,
everyone had to move on and
yeah,
because they didn't want to talk about it. So then they had to go back to being normal,
yeah.
whatever that means. So where in Israel, it was, I'm sure they didn't want to have everybody wanted to talk about it over dinner for the rest of their lives, but there was
It was
an
a shared
open,
experience and
the
acknowledgement.
shared experience, and the culture embraced the
Hmm.
survivors as part, and in many ways, that's probably driving a lot of the stuff that has gone on ever since.
Hmm.
So you have all of that. So I think culture is really important. Again, it's being belonging and mattering, isn't it? And those two
Hmm.
things liberate people
Hmm.
from experiences because they are far more than, as we say, their experience. And because we don't liberate and we don't put it on the box and say this is what it is, people are lost in the silence, if you like. But
Yes.
going back to Pat, she was on her own, wasn't she, with
Mm,
Sophie?
mm.
Because systems just can't envisage having that kind of therapeutic relationship, which is why I like the idea of therapeutic communities for survivors as well,
Mhm.
because that could be, you can have that in therapeutic communities because that's what they're about.
Yeah, and the peer support and using various methods, some of them artistic, art therapy or journaling, and obviously writing was so powerful for Sophie and also other survivors like Patricia Debney, I know is a big writer, and obviously you're a gifted writer yourself, but using the body in various ways. It doesn't all have to be talking all the time because that only gets people so far. It doesn't maybe release some of the trapped energy, the frozen stuff, the shutdown. But just one more on psychiatry while I think of it, because I've been at the Critical Voices Network conference in Cork a few times, and there are plenty of survivors who come there and speak and share experiences, including of the abuses of psychiatry, such as being restrained. So if you've been restrained in some kind of terrible, violent way as a child or a young person or via some kind of rape in adulthood, and then you're later on restrained again by people who hold power over you, perhaps because you're acting out or maybe endangering yourself or perhaps others. A lack of awareness, though, among the people doing those acts of the potential for traumatic reenactment is staggering to me if they don't know what might be at the root of it.
I think he's a Danish psychiatrist, so not all psychiatrists are the
Mm,
same. So there's
of
a
course
Danish.
not.
There's some of them are survivors. So
Mhm.
there's a lot of them I suspect are survivors.
Yeah.
But he's written a book that said psychiatry. Wanda Cork has spoken about it as well, and Judith Herman has spoken
Hmm.
about is that psychiatry is committed an act of admission in the nicest possible way by ignoring the science. And some he's actually saying, this Danish psychiatrist is actually saying he's written a book and it's good, it's a crime against humanity.
Mm,
So if you look it back for 200 years, when we kind of shifted from a trauma-informed lens
mm,
that existed, it was kind of around with, we're French psychiatrists, who
mhm.
psychologists who were working in the asylums, English
Yeah.
psychologists who were the version of them, in York. There was
Mm,
the retreat in York. There was a kind of culture of actually being kind to people,
mm,
which is rooted in old knowledge that goes back to classical history and that was actually preserved by Islamic scholars over time in the books that they kept, which was that actually the best way to deal with trauma is kindness,
mm,
is good food, light, kindness, validation, not diminishing what
mm,
has been done, kind of validating and time,
mm,
and that's all when you think about trauma informed, that's all it is.
mm.
And that knowledge has been with us for millennia because we've experienced it. But there are some good psychiatrists, and strangely, one of them you might is Pat Bracken,
Oh yeah,
who
lovely
so
man.
Pat Bracken used to be in Bradford in West Yorkshire, and he kind of was a guy called Phil Thomas. And
Mm,
both of them were really progressive about moving forward the conversation about trauma,
mm,
especially about using the word. But
mm,
yeah, but when you think about a sexual abuse survivor who's held down on the floor and then injected in the buttock
mm,
and left naked in a safe room and all these kind of things, it defies understanding why you may need to support somebody who's really, a danger to themselves or others, but you have to be really very careful about not creating even more issues for
mhm.
that human being down the road. And that's why we need different systems. We need different ways of approaching it. But I think it's Kylie Farm that's being
Yeah.
developed. And I really like the idea of Kylie Farms being everywhere,
Yes.
for people who are experiencing trauma, human distress, or any
Mhm.
psychological distress, because I think that's the future. It's not mental health wards. It's
No.
Kylie Farms. They offer a solution, I think, to lots of issues.
And the fact that they are, it appears to me, not just playing lip service to the importance of lived experience in the design and everything, because co-production, listening to lived experiences is all very trendy, but to have the voices driving the design and the type of offerings and all of that, um, well, it's the essence or part of the essence of trauma-informed care, isn't it, Rob?
It is, I've written co-written a paper on co-production
Mm,
that was published in the British Journal of Social Work, would you
mhm.
believe, some years ago. And it
Excellent.
openly kind of explored the issues with it. So,
Mm,
there's an ideal about it, but it is a compromise on all sides about power.
mm,
You do it properly, then if it's done properly and it's done supportively, then it holds massive potential for creative solutions that will work for everybody.
yeah.
But there has to be a compromise
Hmm.
and it has to be an open, transparent process. And I think that's where it probably fails
Hmm.
because systems already have their boxes to tick before they even begin it in many cases.
Yeah.
And actually but if you do it really well and it's structured in a way that empowers everybody, that is liberating, I think, for systems. That's why I quite like the work of, believe it or not, an economist called Marianne Mazzucato,
Okay.
who's a professor of economics at UCL, and she's written lots of books about mission orientated change. And
Okay.
I think mission orientated change in mental health services, where really it's about not so about maintaining and keeping society safe from all these mad people.
Mm,
It's about liberating all these distressed people so they live good lives and are
mhm,
free to live the way they want to live them without fear and kind of not lost in the chaos and are
mhm,
validated. And that should be the mission of mental
mm,
health services, is to liberate people, not to encase them in maintenance
yeah.
systems.
Thanks, Rob. I will check out that author. She sounds very interesting indeed. And Freud popped into my head as well when you were talking there, because of course he found a link between child sexual abuse and girls and women's emotional distress, and then retracted it when Viennese society couldn't bear to, I suppose, face the ugly truth that can be a part of humanity. Do you think, in some ways, in terms of the activism that you do, that um, this desire to put the blinkers on and not see and not believe that child sexual abuse or sexual violence in general is as prevalent and as problematic as it is it makes it more difficult for people?
So as part of me really thinks, Freud was a coward and
Mm,
kind of has created a problem. He delayed the solution. Another part where I feel sorry for him really, because there is some thought that he was a survivor himself.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so I don't have any kind of empirical evidence to support that, but there are people who argue that he was a survivor, and his daughter was very, very, very protective of him. In
Hmm.
fact, you can't find the etiology of his hysteria anywhere in the archives of the Freud Museum, I believe. So
All
he's kind of
right.
suppressed. And there's a historian who I read an article that he was brought in by the museum. So I'm getting to a point about silencing.
Hmm.
And he was brought into the Freud Museum, and he went through the archive of all the letters and everything that Freud. So Freud made lots of mistakes,
Sure.
and kind of things. So but he was a really, really powerful thinker. He also nicked lots of stuff of other people, including the French guy called Genet, and he kind of did all of that stuff. But when the letters are written and all the rest, he was consciously struggling with it all and wanted to retract. And when he retracted, a lot of it was about money, I think.
Mm.
So he kind of, because he lost all his clients, because he was charged a lot of money for one of those
Yeah.
sessions.
Well,
So
then the
all of that.
families would be terrified. What might Freud find, or you know?
So the theory of seduction. So in effect, he switched it around.
Yeah.
So
Oh
it
God.
wasn't the parents who were abusing the children; it was the children who were subduing, who were bringing
Yearning
this
or
sexual abuse on themselves from and it's kind of crazy stuff. So he did that. And of course, his waiting room filled up again because then
mm,
he could kill the children then because the parents would
yep.
pay,
Yeah.
to do the stuff. And the story you can read the history of it. But the archive, this guy wrote this paper which really unpacked. So I feel sorry for him, but I think we all have paid a price for Freud
Mm,
because it's been an anchor for those who wish to suppress reality.
mm,
And the reality is that sexual abuse has been everywhere, especially since industrialization in our cities, because children are far more vulnerable on the streets.
mm,
That's why we have children's acts.
mm,
Anyone who's done that understands all of that child protection history,
mm,
is that's where it existed. And we need to reverse out of that silence because we can spend billions on. I was talking about the other day. We spend billions on. I mean, I'm not a pacifist,
mm,
but I think one aircraft carrier that the Brits have built.
mm,
Just the price of that aircraft carrier deployed into child protection
mm,
or changing the way that would make a massive amount of difference
mhm,
over a 4 or 5 year parliament because that's billions and billions of pounds. So all of that is kind of about choices.
mm,
And we now have in the UK a national inquiry that took £200 million worth of public money and 8 years of focused forensic examination of lots of different case studies. And it's still sitting on a shelf 2 years after it was published for its final recommendations, none of which have been implemented.
yeah.
And some of them weren't even fully acknowledged by the previous government in the UK. So they said they wanted more consultations. I don't know how much more consultation you can get than 8 years of forensic
Yeah.
examination, like very expensive King's councils as they are now. So,
Mm,
so society's got the issue.
mm,
Yeah, it's society that needs to resolve these issues. It isn't systems, it's not the NHS, it's not psychiatrists.
mm,
It's society waking up to the reality of abuse in its communities, which is
mm.
everywhere.
But it is hard. I mean, I've been in rooms and hearing the pain, feeling the pain of someone else, when they do sometimes at a public event kind of let rip about something. You feel it in your own guts, and people don't want to feel it in their own. That's part of it, I think. I've said this to Sophie that there's a very real desire to turn away and not see and not hear when that pain is felt in the body. So, but we do need, if we care about the safety and well-being of children, which most people profess to, then we do need to be able to sit with that discomfort somehow a little bit more. Um, have you any ideas how we can make the the deeply painful somehow not more palatable, but just more both speakable for the survivor and sort of hearable for people who would much rather believe that it's quite rare?
So the current issue going on, which completely kind of unpacks that,
Mm.
which is there is a art exhibition using photography portraits of survivors that's been developed by a young male survivor. He's got male and females who are involved in a
Mm.
growing community of interest where they take portraits and they do a narrative account amongst the portraits, and then he takes it around and exhibits it. And Glasgow University invited him last week or the week before to exhibit in the main foyer, one of their prestigious research institutes at
Amazing.
Glasgow, and his kind of thing. And they put it in the thing and stuff, and then he left. And it was about mental health, and it was about changing the invisibility of mental health. That was
Mm.
something, the title and stuff. So they went away, and then somebody who was a survivor had gone in, and then that they didn't really know, but had emailed them or got in touch with them and said, because it didn't, so your exhibition has been moved into a side room. So they kind of
Wow.
contacted the university and they asked the university what's going on. And they said, oh, we'd moved it into the side room because there had been some people who had gone and looked at the exhibition and they'd read some of the narrative accounts. Some of them are quite graphic. So
Mm.
this will come to that at the end, which I think to go to your point at the very
Mm.
beginning about shock jockeying, as it may be
Yeah.
called. We'll be careful with it. So doing stuff. So they put it in. The issue is the university hadn't spoken to them about it.
Mm.
Of course, that's triggered lots of anger because all it did was kind of then they were invisible as participants in it's their photographs, it's their
Mm.
stories,
Mm.
and then putting them into a side room and saying, you might be
Go
dangerous
in
to
there at
people,
your own risk kind of thing. Yeah.
which is what they put into it. So I mean, there needs to be a sign and saying, please, if you're going to go and look and read these accounts, please be aware that there may be graphic contents that you might find
Mm.
upsetting. And if you feel that that's going to be too much for you, please
Mhm.
just look at the photographs and don't
Yeah.
read narratives, something like that, or
Yes.
don't come into it. Give people agency to make a choice about
Mhm.
their own process. But anyway, they moved in there. But now it's reached newspapers. And what it illustrates is I think is society still has what we were talking about, the default to not dealing with it and moving it into the side room,
Mm.
putting it in the shadows because it's too upsetting for people to actually experience the reality of it. So you might argue that maybe some of the narrative should have been less
Mm.
descriptive about the forensic details because that
Mm.
can be upsetting to people. So I don't think you need to like film, isn't it? I don't think you need to see a rape to understand rape is not a good
No.
thing.
Hmm.
So I think, you don't need to watch.
Sometimes less is more, maybe. Yeah.
You can use different methods, can't
Mm.
you, in kind of telling stories and showing reality you don't need to see the rape. I was
Mm.
talking to somebody about it. Whereas a German film where German soldiers are escaping the oncoming Russian um, assaults on the area, moving, and they're retreating, and the citizens are retreating as well. There's a young woman who's
Mm.
retreating, and there's all these trucks driving around. It's chaos,
Mm.
thousands of soldiers, and they kind of focus on the young woman
Mm.
and they grab her, a gang of them grab her, and then they throw her into the back of the truck, and then
Oh.
they're all clambering to get on the back
Mm.
of the truck to get up. You don't need to be in the back of the truck to
Yes,
know
to
what.
know what's happening. Yeah.
So it's the same with this. But I think those exhibitions need to happen,
Mm. Yeah.
and I think discomfort needs to be real without being explicitly designed to shock people. I
Hmm.
think it needs to be a balance of truth without kind of switching people off, which is what you kind
Mm.
of stated, I think. And I think that's a difficult balance, isn't it? Because people want to know you to know how much they hurt. They
Yes.
want you to know how much this has impacted their lives. And they want you to care. They want
Hmm.
to matter to you.
Mm.
And therefore they're telling you, and they believe they have to tell you how bad it was for
Mm.
you to really get it and to make it very explicit.
Mm.
And I think that's justified, that's understandable, isn't it? But at the same time, it puts you into the side room,
Yes.
which creates a conflict, which actually might turn out really positive because perhaps the university is now waking up to, and it was using trauma informed as its defense. It was saying it was being trauma informed
Yeah. Gas.
as a defense.
Mm.
It,
I suppose was maybe saying was trying to protect the members of the public from being traumatized by these stories. But it's just again to me a bit of a societal dissociative split as well, that we care about children. We don't want them to be harmed. We're morbidly fixated on paedophiles. And yet we want to stick our fingers in our ears and blindfold ourselves if people actually say, "Hey, it happened to me," and I'd like a bit of acknowledgement. So it's but I do think the photographs showing a range of ages, faces, backgrounds, skin colors to show just how common it is a way of seeing the eyes of a survivor, and as well maybe seeing because I've seen the flickers of little children and adults at times, when you can see that vulnerable inner child. Um, it is very powerful and it is uncomfortable and it's very sad and enraging, but we kind of need to feel those feelings with people to help them heal, I think, a little bit and not just leave them on their own, as you
I think
say.
I think I think that's absolutely right, Jane. I think that, the only way I now don't, I mean, I've had this for 25 years. I started 25 years ago doing this
Mm,
stuff and run an agency that delivers counselling and does all the other things that you do. But also, but at my heart, I'm an activist.
mm,
I want to see social change. I want to see children protected. And I want to see society kind of really put the resources into doing that rather
mm,
than, every time there's a scandal and there's new scandals all the time, isn't there, around sexual
mm,
violence. So the system, I think a lot of people think is all over now, it'll go
mm,
away. And I think there's a kind of default to that, it'll go away.
mm,
It doesn't go away because I think the culture has shifted. What we're seeing, and a lot of other services are seeing, especially young males, is young males. We're seeing more and more young males disclosing in their early 20s. That wasn't the case 20 years ago. 20 years ago, they were all my age.
mm.
Now they're all in their a lot of them are in their early 20s. And they kind of come and tell you exactly what the issue is. And they know and they're aware and they're not willing to sit in the silence anymore and kind of not deal with it. They want to
That's
deal with it.
wonderful. I mean,
It
that
is
is actually a
wonderful.
wonderful shift. And why do you think that is? Is it because of social media and greater awareness around trauma and greater awareness of it's not your fault, and mental health struggles normally have their origins in some sort of neglect or violence or abuse?
So I think it's about culture. I think
Okay.
it's about cultural change. I think it's about stories.
Mm,
I think the story, it takes a long, we kind of sit in system, people sit in systems and often they're cultural silos, aren't they? They're
mm,
kind of fixed on an ideological view of what psychiatry is a perfect
mm,
example of that in many cases. It kind of believes in its model and nothing will shift from it. But society isn't like that.
mm,
Society is a kind of multiverse of change and conversations amongst itself. And that process often isn't visible often to us within our kind of lens at that moment in time. But if you kind of pan out and you look at it from a multiple lens, what you see is a kind of matrix of change.
mhm,
And it's happening all the time in small narrative kind of sounds and bites and changes. But over time they accumulate and they gain momentum. And I think that's what's happening.
mm,
So change, some people argue, doesn't come from those in our systems. It comes from the street. It comes
mm,
from people, comes from young people who kind of throw out all the stuff they think is rubbish. And they say, well, actually, this is what this is about. So
mm,
when they appear in GP series saying, I haven't got, there's an issue, isn't there, with some of the labels that are floating around. Everybody wants a particular label at the moment.
mm,
But when they're appearing and saying that they've got trauma, that's where I've got trauma. I
mm,
think that's what the medical profession in particular has to wake up.
mm.
That, the reality is coming to your door, that people are aware of their own experiences and they are connecting the dots.
Yeah, I feel rubbish, depressed, and can't sleep and can't eat, and maybe have eating issues because of something that happened. Then you're right. The doctors need to kind of start understanding the gravity of that and not rushing to pathologize or necessarily medicate for depression, although that might be a solution for some people. I was just going to ask you, and I'm conscious of your time, Rob, but the male survivor, because um, I think society doesn't want to look at this enough. And there are women who are married to male survivors and, people who work with male survivors and could be saying stupid, hurtful, harmful things about the phenomenon of sexual violence against boys and men. And someone in the prison system actually told me that in one particular Irish prison in their work, about I think it was 80% of men had disclosed unwanted sexual contact. I don't think we're grappling with this as, as sexual violence and its links maybe to violent behavior among the prison population or other things, or addiction, certainly. But are we remotely aware of the prevalence of um, sexual abuse or sexual violence against men?
I think we've been aware for a lot. I think we've been aware since Victorian times that people are brutalized in childhood.
Hmm.
I think ever since we kind of started to look at it, I think the issue is that people then commit crimes of whatever level of crime they commit. Then they kind of, we forget about the reasons why they're still responsible. If you commit a
Mm,
crime, you're responsible for the crime. But, it's the reasons, isn't it? It's where the ACE responsive
mm,
stuff comes. But we're not willing to deal with it. There are programs now running in the UK that are starting to deal with it. And when their outcome data comes out, I think you'll be fascinated by that. So they're working across all a range of prisons in the Northwest and have been doing for some years now and kind of seeing real with outcomes, I'm told. And we need to do more of that because prisons cost a fortune.
mm,
They cost a fortune for the prisons, but they cost a fortune in society generally for the impacts on family, friends, and the individual themselves.
mm,
So we need to do that. I think that we're waking up to that, but not from any moral kind of insight or intellect. I think it's economics. I
mm.
think if you can reduce alcohol, drug addiction, majority of people in those services have adversity in their childhood,
Sure.
mostly sexual violence. So if you start to deal with that, problem is when they're perpetrated as well, it becomes
Yeah.
more complicated. So you have all of those things, and if we don't do it, this will never stop.
Mm,
Unless you have a war, a mission to end things. The only way you're going to reduce in the UK now, the policy would be 50% reduction in violence against women and girls. Violence against women and girls actually includes males in the United Kingdom inside that statement, would you believe? So it's
right.
kind of
Yeah.
they're in the strategy. So it's kind of just don't have their own strategy. If you only way you're going to reduce that is a massive mission. And you can't reduce it on the resources that currently exist. You're
Mm,
going to have to plow the same amounts of money into that and the education and maybe even new services
mm,
to actually deal to get anywhere close to 50% reduction in 10 years
mm,
of the levels of interpersonal violence that exist within our
mm.
society. That's the only way you can do that.
Yeah. And I've asked a few people before as well if they think that at least for some males, who develop a kind of a visceral rage sometimes against women, that does that even require a trauma responsive approach to understand what might have happened? I mean, maybe nothing happened. Maybe it was domestic violence perpetrated by the man in their life that gave them these anti-female views. But sometimes they're very violent women as well. When we're talking about attachment and disrupted attachment and relational modeling, feeling safe with women kind of begins with our primary caregiver, who's usually our mom. And I just think we need to be quite brave in looking in places that we don't want to look as well sometimes. Um, do you
I
think
think
that makes sense that we're not saying that all violence against women obviously is called by women who are not very loving, supportive mothers, but that perhaps we might need to look at that as well in the context of eradicating gender-based violence. Does that make sense?
it makes absolute sense and it's very difficult to say, isn't it? Because it's
Yeah.
kind of a complex
Mm,
conversation. The reality is this does not end unless you have the complex conversations.
mm,
If you just go, my view of it
mm,
is after, 25, 26 years plus looking at it, unless you're willing to step outside of ideological limitations and actually have a look at everything
mm,
and see how it all comes together, you will never end it.
mm,
Unless you do that
mm,
and you have a look at women's prisons, if you go into any women's
mm.
prison, they can be as violent as
Yeah.
men's prisons. So, and you can say the same causes are creating it. They kind of manifest themselves in different ways because men can be stronger,
Mm,
but women can be just as violent in prisons as men can be in
mm,
prisons. So we need to unpack the whole thing.
mm,
Because I remember meeting some very, very eminent first wave feminists, I believe. I think I got that right. They were kind of 70s kind of academics many years ago. And I had a train journey with one of them. We were traveling back to the north. And we had this discussion very similar to what we're having now. And she said, we have to go through the ideological conversation because it's important because of patriarchy and all
mm,
these other issues. They need to be aired and we need to
mm.
kind of really
For sure.
get them out into the open and discuss what validity they have in different kind of intersectional places. But he said, in the end, we're all going to the same place. we're all going to dealing with the human part of us, whether we're male or female, whatever other kind of place you want to be situated, is this human that creates these issues. And it's only when we start to unpack all of that and start to deal with it that we'll start to end it.
Hmm.
Yeah, and that's what she was a very prominent feminist thinker, is that actually that's where we're all going, is to
Hmm.
not have any unspoken conversations. It needs to be spoken about
Hmm.
so that we can end it. So,
Yeah, it definitely makes sense to me that in a way nothing can be off the table as so taboo that it can't be aired. Again, there'll be different factors in any abuser's history that might have led them down that path. But absolutely, if ultimately we want safer children, safer societies, safer women, men, more connected communities, we need to kind of get a bit more real. And again, comfortable with the uncomfortable aspects of life. I've just one more for you, Rob, if that's okay. And it's my kind of big, massive whammy of a question for everyone. Um, what can politicians and policymakers do to enable all children to have a safe, healthy, connected, and kind of equitable childhood so that they're well placed to flourish as adults?
I think we're in a very changeable political moment in time across the world, aren't we? But
Hmm.
I never thought it would be destabilized as much as it seems to be destabilized at the moment. But politicians have an opportunity, as we kind of look at the mirror of where we might go, to change direction. And I think on children, the real war for the real threat to our society is abuse of children. It
Mm,
creates so many issues, I'm sure you'll know as well as I do, across all sorts of dimensions and domains, that actually that's where the real war is. We need to protect ourselves, obviously, against the Putins and
mm,
Russian tanks
mm,
coming across the border and invading
mm,
Ukraine and Poland and all the rest of the stuff that goes on. But actually, the real threat to our society, the biggest national security threat, is the injuries that are committed on by our children by dysfunctional human beings.
mm,
And if we end that, then the casualty rates for everything start to reduce, because then we get a much healthier society.
mm.
And I remember there was Alice Miller. I don't know if you ever read Alice
Oh
Miller.
yeah.
Yeah, and she kind of gets a mixed rap, doesn't she? But and she was disassociated, according to her son. So, but she spoke very eloquently about we create our barbarians,
Mm,
and those barbarians go on to be Donald Trumps. They go on to be
mm,
Putins. They go on to be, in their worst scenarios, they could destroy us all.
mm.
That's reality. If you've got your finger on a nuclear button and someone's had trauma in childhood
Yeah.
and they're not
Terrifying.
regulated, that's not an acting out day, that's end of days
Yeah.
if they press the button and that goes through. So, it's a very extreme, exaggerated risk,
Mm,
but it is a risk, isn't it? Then one day we have somebody who has a trauma that hasn't been dealt with because we've hidden away for it, and they press a button because
mm,
of a dysregulation that they
mm.
have. And that, would be the end of us all,
Yeah.
basically, or end of everything that we know to be what exists. So we need to deal with trauma, I think, and then reduce the likelihood of those individuals kind of less and less trauma,
Yeah.
less and more kind of access to it. And that's what politicians need to hear. And they need to think long term with missions about that.
Mm,
Whether they are able to do that, whether politicians have the right psychological makeup to kind of
mm,
see it in that way, time will tell. So we're
mm,
waiting to hear what the future is with a new government in the United Kingdom.
mm.
So we'll wait and see where that takes us. But at the moment, no one's absolutely sure.
Yeah, well, it's interesting the proposal to go into mental health wards and try and, see whether people are ready to go back to work. Again, it's totally trauma blind and nonsensical and abusive, really, as a proposal. Um, and
I've never
Christine
heard anything so daft. I've got to be honest with
Daft.
you. Anyone who's ever worked in mental health services, the idea you're going to go into a mental health ward where someone's on even if it's on a voluntary section, and you're going to give them a job coach is going to sit down with them and kind of work out they can go back and work at Morrison's or Tesco's or whatever supermarket chain it is. I'm not sure they've ever been on a mental health ward, kind of
No.
had those conversations. I can hear the language now. Should be very short. So
Yeah, I've seen Foreigner in an interview that, some of our decision makers are psychopathy adjacent, and certainly some proposals are beyond brutal actually if they were to be implemented, and they cost money. As you said, it would be better to invest a whole tranche of money into violence prevention and supporting parents and getting, unmet needs met, better housing or whatever.
I mean, a lot of people, yeah, if you've worked in mental health, you've met people, you've gone to some of the groups. What people really want is community.
Yeah,
What they want, I mean, I used to work in mental health
connection.
stuff, kind of work with people. People need job coaches. They need people to kind of help them to get back into all sorts of things. I'm not sure who works in mental health wards, but what they really, people, we need more of those Kylie farms.
Mm,
We need places where people go on retreats for a couple of years rather than cycling through voluntary sections.
mm,
You need to have environments where they can gain their confidence to work,
mm,
not in a kind of forced way, but in a way they enjoy doing
mm.
because they're working with people they want to be with. And then we all like that, don't we? If we work in teams where we like the team, we actually want to go to work because it's actually
Yes.
good. We
Yeah.
enjoy it. So, and people with mental health distress, wherever level that is, are no different to us. And a quick story for us where we kind of have to go, but it's kind of, I remember in mental health services, there were people who worked in residential units and they kind of heard, I heard two of them speaking once on the sofa, they were having cigarettes and I was standing behind or was behind. So I'm bored, there's no one here to chat to over the weekend. I'm going to ring my CPN and say I'm having a crisis and see if
Oh,
I can
wow.
get myself on the ward for the weekend because I know a lot of people down there and it'd be all right.
Oh,
And when you actually, what it told me was I laughed. I don't kind of, oh, don't dear, these, because what they were searching for is community. They're
yeah.
searching for
Connection.
places where they feel connected. And those places make them feel rather than being on the, so they're no different. People with mental distress, no matter what, are no different to the rest of us. To go
Was,
back to the very
yeah.
beginning of our conversation about relationships and connection, is they're just looking for that. And we need to build more resources, more spaces that actually work to do that better, rather than job coaches on mental health boards. Might not be the best first step. So
Thank you so much, Rob. It's been an absolute pleasure and learning experience, as I knew it would be, chatting to you again about this really important topic. And thank you for the work that you do, your activism, your writing, everything, your relational foremention and creating spaces of safety and belonging for people. This has been Relationships Matter with me, Jane Mulcahy, and Rob Balfour. Thanks so much, Rob.
thank you, Jane, and ditto, because you do excellent. I love your podcast, and I'm very honoured to have been asked to be on this one. Thank you very much. Live long
Thank
and
you.
prosper.
You too. Bye, Rob.